Welcome to The Atlantic Bridge, a podcast about politics viewed from both sides of the pond. My name is Emmett Booth, and I'm here with my co-host, Stefan Sase.
So there were two rather remarkable statements in the weeks past that have been made about the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and we thought they would be a nice jumping off point to change pace a little bit away from Trump and all this election stuff, and more to back to Europe and the role that Europe plays currently in the world and will play in the world ahead. And so the two quotes I have to share with you. The one is from the New York Times, who said that now that Trump has become president, Angela Merkel will be the liberal West's last defender. And British historian Timothy Garton-Ash called her the leader of the free world. And being a German, being called the leader of the free world, it is really a weird feeling, I have to admit. There is this Twitter joke going around that, after two world wars, we might just prevent the third, which would be a kind of a nice twist to the story. And while I'm not nihilistic enough to engage in that kind of joke, it is certainly interesting how the relative positions of each other, of several countries, have switched in this year 2016 and will most likely switch in the upcoming year of 2017 with the elections in France and Germany coming around. So we thought it would be quite nice to actually talk about this a little bit. So to give you some context, we will have elections in Germany next year in September 2017, and Angela Merkel has just announced that she will stand for what will be her fourth term as chancellor. So it will be her 13th to 16th year in power, which might evoke some memories among Americans about the happy old days of old Roosevelt. But it is kind of not too unusual in Germany because we don't have term limits. So this can definitely happen. And we in Germany, we haven't been historically in the Federal Republic, haven't been the most ardent guys to go into foreign policy and interventions and sending the army abroad and stuff. And where we did, the results have been mixed. So ask any American military person about the performance of the German army in Afghanistan, and they will laugh you out of the room. So this is kind of not a topic that many Germans are comfortable with, and overwhelmingly, the position in Germany is like the less intervention and the less entanglement in international politics, the better. And so the perception of Germany within Germany about our role in the world and outside of Germany, with leader of the free world and stuff, it really falls apart like we're talking about two wholly different countries. And now with the renewed talk of more NATO engagement for the European states, especially in terms of military spending, we thought it would be a good idea to try to entangle this knot of Europe's place in international relations. So what is the viewpoint of this from across the pond?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in terms of Germany as being like the leader of the free world, or as a kind of a center for Western or liberal democratic values, whatever you want to say about it going forward, it's interesting to track the American left's view on such things. I mean, the cliche when I was growing up was that France was the beacon. Like, if you want to talk about left, more culture than politics, I guess, but still as a kind of like the cliche in terms of what liberals thought about when they thought about what direction they want to take America in. You talk about France, or you talk about Scandinavia. Germany definitely didn't come up in a lot of the circles I was in, but it seems to be moving more into that position now. I think precisely because Merkel's sticking up for a liberal internationalist order. I mean, that the idea that you can, internationalist institutions have taken a lot of political beating lately on both sides of the pond, even from both sides of the aisle on both sides of the pond. But I think you do have someone like Merkel, whether you're talking about the refugees or whether you're talking about NATO, sticking up for a robust, liberal, humane international order. and that they could certainly be a touchstone for that going forward, given our current president's attitude towards NATO and that kind of the international order legacy of World War II in general. And as you alluded with the elections coming up in France and Germany, and the possibility that France especially might shift strongly in a more nationalist direction, that Germany might increasingly have to take on the burden of that. And, it's interesting to consider that, from our side, because of course, we do have the as you pointed out with the Twitter joke, the history of Germany being the exact thing the internationalist order was designed to contain. Like, the internationalist order that we're talking about only exists to stop Germany from ever doing that again, is the reason that order is there. So that there is a certain beautiful, delicious irony to that. But that's also, that's a testament to how well it's worked, right? That the internationalist order has lasted long enough so as to integrate Germany into it, and to the point where Germany could stand as its champion and protector. We can pat ourselves in the back somewhat for that, but it's certainly bad that it has to be thrust into the spotlight this way, and that Trump seems to be putting our NATO alliances in danger, or if not in danger, at least turning them into something more of a protection racket, shaking down countries for more involvement. Which, you could argue, he always goes on about how, European countries don't contribute enough to defense spending and that they need to pay more of their fair share. So, like, what do you think is how would you summarize the German outlook looking at an American president saying things like that?
This hasn't really gotten into the mainstream yet, sure. Because again, foreign policy is not usually a big topic in Germany. Many people here always feel like it's detached. It is something happening to us, not something that we actively drive. So, for example, to give you a little bit more context, if you look back at the Euro crisis, when Greece had this huge problem with debt, and Germany was a major factor in pushing them towards austerity politics that have only deepened the crisis. In Germany, there is still this feeling that we didn't do anything, like this is a crisis that was forced on us by Greece. Never mind that it always takes two for a debt crisis, a lender and a borrower. Sure. But this is simply something that is not fathomed. It is always stuff happening around us and to us, and we are like an island that is more or less untouched by it. And I experienced this quite often if I try to, as I have to as a political science teacher, we have to talk at some point about Germany's role in the world, and it is always like, what are we going to do? And I'm always like, we are the most powerful country in the European Union. And everyone is always like, what? So, actually, we have the biggest population in the European Union. We are the strongest economy by far. We are definitely the most powerful country in the European Union. And this always comes as a surprise to Germans, like, what? This is totally impossible. We can't have any power in international relations. Everyone knows that. So what you just said with the containment after World War II, this happened. This succeeded so thoroughly in like a re-education of the Germans. Sure. Not only don't we have any ambition to engage ourselves in foreign policy like we did in those darker times, it has become almost unfathomable, which is a problem because Germany does exert real influence, but people aren't aware of it, which means that whenever foreign policy becomes an election issue, like with Greece, you always get this very weird vibe to it, like it's a crisis coming from the outside, of which we have nothing to do with.
This is also,
which in case of the refugee crisis is more true than in the case of the Euro crisis, but even there we bear a huge part of the creation of the conditions that led to it, with the strict enforcement of the Dublin II Accords that basically contained the refugee crisis on the European periphery for years. And so we could always go like, oh, those refugees in Italy and in Greece, yeah, real tragic. It is so sad. It is really unfortunate that we can't do anything about it. And this attitude really blew in our face in 2015, in 2016, because then the floodgates finally broke. And more or less the same thing happened in Greece. It was like an organized looking away from the issue and ignoring the issue as long as possible, and then suddenly you get hit by it full force. So this is basically the context for domestic politics, how we look at foreign policy.
Yeah, that's interesting.
If that makes any sense to you.
It does. It's almost psychologically rooted in that way, that attitude towards those issues, which is interesting. I mean, one of the interesting things for me about Trump's foreign policy is you have this mixture of wanting to pull back but still be dominant. Like he wants to, he ostensibly doesn't want to have foreign intervention, military foreign interventions. He wants to pull out of international institutions, or at least, threaten to, in order to shake people down. And yet, you still see that instinct where he doesn't want to lead from behind, or he doesn't want to be seen as a coward, he doesn't want to be seen as weak, so he still has to assert that he could bomb countries if he wanted to, or that he likes Russia's expansionism, or like it's these weird mix of signals he sends, because again, I think it's in large part psychological, that he, in terms of policy, as close as you can get with Trump in policy, that he wants to move in a more nationalist, less internationalist direction, but there's that instinct, that manliness thing that, that America has to be the biggest and the best, and that relates to me, Donald Trump, being the biggest and the best thing that he can't quite give up. And that's an interesting thing to tease out in American foreign policy going forward, is, the vision of, the liberal internationalist order, which certainly has problems with it and certainly has corruption and elites that are cut off from the consequences of their actions. Or you have, what Trump is pushing isn't quite libertarianism, but it's just this kind of trying to split the difference between the current internationalist order and the more kind of America first attitude he's putting forward. So it's not quite isolationism he's talking about. It's more about effect, as always with Trump, more about effect and belligerence and attitude. And it seems more like just the policy details kind of fall from there. So it's, another problem with Trump is that he often seems to change his mind depending on the last person he talked to. Like right after he talked with Obama, he was suddenly more into protections about healthcare and so forth. So that could certainly influence his attitude towards Europe and international politics going forward. But pro-Russian activity does seem to be one of the most consistent parts of the Trump platform. This is something I don't really know anything about. What's the connection between Russia and the German right? Do you have strong connections there as we do? As we're starting to build with the Russia and the American alt-right?
Yeah, the role of Russia is kind of weird, and I guess talking about Russia now is as a good point as any. It seems to me that Putin's strategy of recognizing that he cannot compete on a military level, right, and a pure traditional projection of force, like in the Cold War, that he now has to try and destabilize Western society to kind of attack them from within. That worked like a charm. And the German right, the AfD, is also very pro-Putin in a way, like very much like all the other populist parties as well. But in Germany, of course, we have kind of a more mixed history with relations to Russia than you have in the United States. Okay. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the United States, it's more or less like Russia is a very far away place, and then World War II happens, and then they become the major competitors. So for basically all of your history, you know Russia as the adversary. And then they're like the poor cousin or something. Yeah. But we in Germany, we have a much more mixed and wildly swinging back and forth relationship with Russia. There is a strong currents fighting in German foreign policy. You have the transatlantic faction, which always tries to tie Germany into the Western orbit, Great Britain and the United States. Then you have a faction that tries to align Germany with France mostly, but they are very much in decline. You don't have them really. Their big time was 50s, 60s. But still, this is also a strong impulse that we have in Germany, work together with France against Great Britain in the United States. And then you have a faction that is trying to come to an agreement with Russia, not in terms of like an alliance or working together or anything, but in like a live and let live kind of way. That's more or less the traditional social democratic position. And they are currently dusting it off in the hopes of gaining some political points for the 2017 election. But this is not like the populist stance that you find with Trump and the AfD and UKIP and the Front National, where you have this actual admiration of them. This social democratic position that is also shared in some other quarters is really more like with the active goal of diffusing critical situations, so like trying to deflate everything a little bit. It's deterrence, not deterrence, detente, basically, like let's all cool down. And those four strands of foreign policy preferences always try to pull Germany in their preferred direction, and we're kind of oscillating back and forth between these poles. So you have, for example, usually under conservative chancellors like Helmut Kohl or Adenauer, you have a stronger commitment to NATO and to the Great Britain and to France and to the United Kingdom. And with Social Democrats, you usually have a little bit more of distance and the attempt of placing yourselves as a neutral kind of in the middle. When the United States and Russia get into a fight, their instinct is to stay out of it. The best example of this was the Iraq War.
Yes,
when Gerhard Schröder forged his alliance with French President Jacques Chirac, I think it was at the time, and stayed out of it. This is your fight, not ours. We don't have anything to do with it, and we are again going back and forth with this. And Merkel is the first conservative chancellor that is not by inclination a transatlantic person, which may be because she's from East Germany, and East Germany has no tradition whatsoever in this regard. So she comes to this without emotional baggage.
Sure. That makes sense. Now, does the faction that wants stronger engagements or the same amount of strong engagements with the United States and the United Kingdom, are they back in their heels after Brexit and the victory in Trump victory in the United States, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, their high time was in the beginning of the war against the terror.
Sure,
so, like in 2001, 2002, this was really strong. And then Gerhard Schröder won his election on the back of actively campaigning against the United States in their foreign policy, because this is also a very strong tradition of anti-Americanism in Germany. You can very easily pull the switches, which get us into an anti-American frenzy. So that is, if you are a transatlantic person, that's a real problem there. And forces within the Conservative Party that are most entrenched in the transatlantic wing have lost their internal power struggles against other factions within the party. So currently they are pretty weak.
I see. It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Russia's influence, you're definitely right about the very different relationships our respective countries have to Russia. And the German relationship to Russia obviously ties into a bigger question with Russia, which is it part of Europe or not? Like, should it be part of this overall community, or is it invading this overall community? What should be the goal, and how do you conceive of it? And obviously, Putin is a Russian nationalist who is trying to, like you say, he can't win he can't even have the posture that Russia used to have during the Cold War. So he's, fighting these kind of asymmetric battles to do with, weakening other institutions, making institutions in other countries look foolish or that they don't represent their constituents. So you have Trump, or Brexit obviously supports that overall goal. He's just trying to kind of, inflict termites on institutions in other countries and just try to weaken them from below. So as far as I can tell, so that in the future Russia can then be again at the same level as these other countries and have much more power on the world stage. But certainly the German rights can have a different relationship to that than the American right. But if you have the situation where you have an American president who openly admires Russia and has made all these inclinations that he doesn't want to get in Russia's way on policy, if you have the United Kingdom struggling with internal politics and pulling more of the international order, then Germany would, I imagine, have to stand as a stronger bulwark against Russian interventionism. How do you think that would go if you all had to be the tip of the spear?
I don't really think that we are in a good position to do that.
Sure.
Because on one hand, the German public is very much against it. Mm-hmm. You would find it hard to marshal a majority to actively oppose Russia. You could see this in the Crimean crisis already, which was most likely what we care about Ukraine. We really shouldn't start a war over Ukraine. And again, the German people do not like Germany to actively project power, not because we have a general problem with projecting power, but because it's expensive. And German foreign policy is all about the price tag. And we really don't like the price tag that is attached to an interventionist foreign policy or even a leading role. This is also something about the stuff, when I talk about we are the most powerful country in the European Union, and it's always like, yeah, but do we really need to do this, because we don't want to. So the Americans have, for a long time now, always tried to get this message in, like we have a contractual obligation to spend 2% of GDP for military, that's in the NATO treaties, and we are at like 1.2 or 1.3, so way below the target, and this has been the case like forever. German military is in a very sorry state, and this is something Germans actually like. We don't want our military to be strong because then you would just get into the temptation of using it, and no one wants that. But if you compare this to what do the United States have, 3.5-4% of GDP, this doesn't compare on so many levels.
Yeah, you're right.
So we really aren't in the position to do anything, even if we wanted to. The German military has right now, I think, like 5,000 or 6,000 people spread across the world, like in Kosovo and in Bosnia and in Afghanistan, and it is stretched to the breaking point. Sustaining these 6,000 or 7,000 guys, whatever it is, so you see what our real capabilities are, not to mention of sending troops to Ukraine or Poland or the Baltic states to defend them. This is more or less a pipe dream. I don't know how many of those stories have made it to the United States, but the state in which the German army is incredibly bad. They had some reports made a year ago or two in which they detailed how much stuff is actually operational, and these were numbers like the German Navy has like 80 helicopters. Of those, 3 are operational, and this is a trend that goes through everything. You have like 1 in 10 or something like that is even remotely capable of doing something, and spare parts are missing all over the place. And then we had the scandal about our assault rifle, which tends to overheat if you use it too much and lose accuracy like really fast, and all that kind of stuff. even if we wanted to, we simply couldn't. So this talk about Germany being the leader of the free world has, by necessity, to be in the quote-unquote softer areas of foreign influence, like especially economic influence. There we can really make a difference, because we kind of have deep pockets. We don't like to open them, but in theory we have them. And we have a large cloud because we are one of the, if not the leading export nation of the world. So if we close our market somewhere, as we did in the Crimean crisis, actually, this really tends to hurt. So this is something where Germany could, in theory, take a leading role, but anybody won't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think obviously you're unlikely to get into a shooting war with Russia, and Putin's not even pushing in that direction. But yeah, I mean, there's so many soft power levers you can use. But yeah, the question is wanting to. And like I was saying with Trump, there is still an instinct, even in isolationist parts of American politics, to want to be America on the national stage, and that there is a kind of collective psychological enjoyment of being at the in the international spotlight, at the center of international affairs. We have come to like that as a country a lot. Whether for good or ill. And if you don't have that kind of national willpower behind that, then yeah, it's, I guess, taking a consistent leading role in the international order is unlikely, because on the merits, taking a consistent lead in the international order can suck, because you're the one spending all the money, and you're the one that has a lot of responsibility, and the enemies of said international order are focusing on you. And so the benefit is, there are two benefits. One is if you believe morally in the causes you're fighting for, and the other is if you as a country psychologically, collectively, in terms of your identity, like being that country, as my country definitely does. And if your country, if a given country doesn't, then the obvious costs of being the international leader will pile up and become obvious. And like you say, if you view foreign policy understandably through the lens of not wanting to go bankrupt paying for it, then that's gonna come to cause pretty quickly. So that would definitely slow down German leadership operations. But like you say, I mean, they can definitely wield economic influence. It's just Russia works in, again, such asymmetric ways that they're not even trying to. Putin's not even really setting up a competing order at this point. He's just pulling out the foundations of the existing one, which maybe is part of what Trump admires. And then so there has to be a robust internationalist response to that, and it's just it'll be interesting to see what direction it comes from, because it seems kind of muddled at the moment.
I think what the Americans right now are realizing is, I guess, the word that most aptly describes it, is the same thing that the British realized before them, like 70, 80 years ago. Being the world's strongest power with all those responsibilities of upholding world order is freakishly expensive. And I think the Americans have for decades not really realized just how expensive it was for them. And in the last couple of years, this has started to sink in with more and more people, which might be one part of Trump's appeal for those few people who care about foreign policy. But if you look at this really weird point that you have in all American polling all the time, like people always want to cut foreign aid.
Right, of course, because they think it's like a quarter of the budget.
As if this was the source of most cost. Yeah. But you can see that there is an unwillingness to spend money even in the American public. But that seems mostly to be a problem of not really identifying the source of where the money really is spent. Sure. Whereas with the way Germany projects power, like the big loans to Greece and all those bailouts, you can see them on the balance sheet like right away. So cause and effect is more clear than with the quote-unquote defense spending that the United States have. That tends to obscure stuff a little bit more. But the realization just how dependent the world is on the American way of doing things is ever so slightly dawning on the Americans, and you have an increasing tediousness with it. It feels like people get tired of it, and in politics as well. Like politicians and functionaries and what have you, the elites, to again use air quotes here, they too lose interest in spending political capital and real capital in upholding this unquestioned number one position that the United States have. And if Trump really gives the death kick to TPP, we will see relatively quickly how this happens. You can see it already with the Philippines turning to China, and if TPP really fails, whatever the effects may be, one effect will be that China fills the power vacuum, because someone always fills the power vacuum. And the same is true, obviously, of Europe. If the United States withdraw their engagement from Europe, and Germany does not go into the breach, and I don't see that we will, and Great Britain doesn't, and I don't see that they will, naturally, Russia will take center stage simply by the laws of political physics, because the United States, with their retreat, with their withdrawal, will create a power vacuum, and that has to be filled by someone. And that someone standing by is Putin's Russia, and is however the guy is pronounced in China. I won't even try. And I don't even want to say that is necessarily a bad thing. So I don't want to sing too much the praises of American interventionism and Team America World Police here. I think it is better, but no way of knowing really. It might just be that returning to a multipolar world order will be more stable. I kind of doubt it, but I'm not entirely convinced it's not the case, Yeah. I don't have too much stakes in this. But it is definitely a realization that is happening for many people. And for more Americans right now than for Europeans, I'm always telling people, like, if the United States do this, because they're always, yay, and less American military in Europe. And I'm like, that means that someone needs to actually fill that gap, and that someone will be, among others, us. Like, we will have to spend more for military. Do you really want that? And it's always, hell no. And yeah, it was the United States until now. The guys you hate. So someone has to. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, I think it's good to make a distinction between internationalism and interventionism. I mean, there are ways you can set up strong international institutions that do a lot of good in multiple countries and lead to strong cultural exchange between countries, that you can do that without, that doesn't go necessarily hand in hand with bombing as many people as possible. And I feel like in a lot of political discussions, those have become one and the same thing, that you are either an isolationist or you are a hawk. And that's really unfortunate that the robust, liberal, humane international order as an ideal seems to be dying out in a lot of countries, which is really a shame. Because, in theory, I could get behind the idea of a more multipolar world and America, dropping bombs in fewer places. Yeah, I mean, that's not getting rid of power itself or the abuse of power itself. Like you say, someone will fill the vacuum. And that's Russia and China, and they're worse. I'm sorry, they just are. Their governments are just objectively far worse on human rights, on corruption, and how they think about other peoples and other countries. I mean, we're really going to, ask anyone in Tibet and Taiwan how it feels to have China now be the dominant player on the Asian stage. It's not good. I mean, I get the sense that Trump thinks about it like, okay, each country is going to have their own separate sphere of influence in their own little area, and every country gets its own nationalism and its own national pride, and we're all going to be fine because we each have our own things, and we're going to leave each other alone. And that's, I get the sense that's kind of what he's going for. But, Russia and China don't believe in that. Russia and China are not looking to be left alone. Russia wants Europe. China wants Asia. They want massive economic and political and cultural influence in these areas. And I think that would overall probably have negative consequences. I mean, again, there's certainly some good trade-offs I can imagine in American changing foreign policy and pulling back in some regards.
But on the whole, I want to reform American internationalism, not junk it. I think we need to do it better. I think we need, stronger, more robust, and more transparent and less corrupt institutions. But I don't think getting rid of international institutions themselves just lets warlords take over. And you have. That's always the thing I have about the Russian government and the Chinese government is like the way they operate. It's as if they're running a small city, or as if they're running just like a local corrupt police force. Like they act like they're the mob, but they're running a gigantic modern country with huge influence, and that's just a terrifying combination. Because obviously kleptocracies are always bad, but if it's just Turkmenistan, you can contain it, and it's help the people within as best you can, but the world's going to be okay. But if you have countries that massive being run like this with no pushback, yeah, I think that's bad on the whole for international order. I mean, I definitely disagree with American intervention in Iraq and a lot of the straight-up crimes we committed against people along the way. But on the whole, robust, liberal, international, humane orders prevent war and, decrease the overall number of people who die in violent conflict. Certainly not to zero, but less, and offer the opportunity to continue decreasing that number. I think it's a shame to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as is our idiom, to get rid of the institutions entirely just because of corrupt actors within them. I think that would be a real shame if the United States and the UK and Germany and France go in that direction, because, like you say, Russia and China will definitely fill the vacuum. And I certainly have problems with the TPP, but it wasn't. The TPP is not designed to have American tendrils spread over the globe and control it just because it's there to counter China, and without it, basically what I'm saying is you can't get rid of influence itself. That's not the concept of powerful actors influencing. That's not going away. If you remove yourself as a powerful actor from the equation, another powerful actor will be there. So at the end of the day, I'm just always, as we both said before, my instincts are always towards reform rather than revolt within a given institution. And this is especially true in this case because there's no getting around the nature abhors a vacuum thing, as you pointed out. And that's definitely gonna come into play with both Russia and China.
I mean, the elephant in the room when you are talking about institutions is, of course, the European Union.
Yes.
But the European Union is a pretty powerful entity in economic terms, like a raw purchasing power and all that kind of stuff. But we have never spoken with one voice on foreign policy. There's this famous Kissinger quote, when I want to call Europe, what number do I dial? And this question has never been answered. We have tried in one of the many European Union reforms, to get a European foreign minister installed. And after many compromises and conferences, we finally created something like that, and it has absolutely zero power and is totally unimportant. So there is still no European number to call. And you could see this, for example, in the Crimean crisis, where it was basically like whoever shows up makes the decisions. And in that case, really, Germany did show up together with France once again. But Britain, for example, stayed on the sidelines. And if you look at Libya, there Germany stayed on the sidelines, and it was a British-French show, and there is no rhyme or reason to it. It is just like whoever seems to be near it geographically or to have any stakes in it for some reason or another, like pretensions of being a great power in France's case, or maybe geostrategical considerations in Britain's case, or a longing for empire, I don't know. Or is in our case here simply a geographic proximity that makes it impossible to stay on the sidelines. But there is nothing like a united front. In the times that there have been fruitless discussions about the creation of a European army to actually address some of these issues, give me €1 for each one, and I have some serious money on the side. So there isn't anything going to happen in that direction. And it is still very classic axis of power in which you have France and Great Britain as the main drivers of European foreign policy, especially given that there are still veto powers in the United Nations and are nuclear powers. And then you have Germany, which in theory should be much more powerful than it actually chooses to be. And Germany itself is very good at creating power vacuums. There is a crisis that the European Union really could address, and we just stay silent. Mm-hmm. And this, by definition, creates a power vacuum. Most of the time, France and Great Britain fill it in, but not always. And if they don't, either no one does or really somebody else, whoever happens to be in a certain spot. And you can look at regional powers like Turkey, which is becoming a dominant power in the Near Middle East, or you have Russia regarding Eastern Europe, and the very fringes of Eastern Europe. Like Georgia or countries like that. Sorry. Where we don't have any discernible stakes, and where the United States would be much more willing to stake a claim of protection against encroachment of a foreign power, where we are much more like, we don't care. And again, it is, I guess, a position you can take. It is not like one of those is obviously right and the other is obviously wrong. I tend to agree with what you just said. If you give me the choice of having a dominant Russia or a dominant United States as my major, not perhaps ally, but geostrategical neighbor, I always take the United States. But this is not a given. There is this huge segment of the population, and especially in the right-wing populist circles, that is convinced that if you push out the United States, then there will be world peace. Exactly. Which I find preposterous, because the United States are certainly not without their faults, and you have, especially in the Cold War era, you did so much stupid shit.
Oh, awesome.
I mean, no way around that, but on the one hand, this is always pretty rich coming from Germans, and on we are experts in stupid shit. And on the other hand, it is not like the Russians or the Chinese are exceptionally nice guys. They just aren't powerful enough to stir up that much shit around the globe. But if they could, they no doubt. They would do the same thing, like with assassination by drone and capturing people and taking them to some underground facility and all that kind of stuff. It is not like the Americans invented that kind of stuff. That doesn't make it better. But it is not like you would be the devil incarnate, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and there's possibility for self-correction with the American system. Reform exists. You can make things better. You don't have that under Putin's Russia and the current regime in China. There's no self-correcting mechanism. They're autocrats, and that, it's about the pushing the United States out. You get the world peace thing. Again, I think behind that there's this assumption that if you just leave every country to their own little nationalism, it's going to be okay, and that's just not the case. You have these actors that are, we talk about Putin as a Russian nationalist, which is certainly true. But he also has his own international agenda. It's just a much more shady and corrupt and illegal and hacker and banker and guerrilla-driven kind of internationalism than the normal standard definition of it. It's like a Cold War on the cheap is the way Putin is running things, and that he's not. If America pulls out, he will move in. I mean, that's just you can cast that as depressing or as just kind of accepting the lesser of two evils, as is often argued. But again, the lesser of two evils is A, lesser, and B, offers the possibility to improve upon it. I think you can make American institutions work better. You can make liberal international institutions work better. And you have to, because talk about Germany's unwillingness to assert power as a powerhouse of the European Union. Eventually, if you don't use power you do lose it. If you never assert the strength, the economic influence you have, then it starts to go away because people will start to think of you as a paper tiger. Now, obviously that shouldn't justify any given action just by itself. You shouldn't assert influence just because you want to assert influence. But eventually, it starts to decay simply because you aren't using it, and that's definitely going to tell as Russia and China have all these little avenues where they can assert influence. And yeah, it's not like China just wants to be left alone. China has conceived of itself nationally as the center of the world for a long time, and will continue to do so. And Trump's solution to that is to let Japan and South Korea have nukes, which is a terrifying. Not have nukes, but have their entire the entire military structure of the Pacific with no safeguards, and it's just a terrifying concept. Especially, of course, with North Korea in the neighborhood. That's a whole separate discussion. But I just wish the instinct when you see corruption and failure among international institutions, I wish the instinct was to capture them and make them better rather than retreat from them. And it seems like retreat from them is the instinct right now in a lot of Western countries. And I think that's highly unfortunate. Because I think, again, as I was raised a good liberal in America, the idea of a humane internationalist liberal order of cooperating countries was the ideal. Like that's what I was raised. Like that's what we're going to be moving towards, and that's what that's what your foreign politics is going to be about, and that's what it's all going to be built around. Is this goal? And it doesn't really look like the UN as now, and certainly we have the problems with how America acts, and the WTO and the World Bank and all these organizations have plenty of problems. But this is the order we want to build towards, and that doesn't seem to be the dream much on the left, certainly at this point, at least in my country. The right has turned wholly against the institutions, and like I said, what used to keep the right on the international stage was the visceral, emotional liking of being the centerpiece country, and liking of being the spotlight, and liking that the rest of the world was taking cues from us. Like we enjoy that psychologically, especially on the American right. And I think that appears to be dying. And again, it's so frustrating because it's like I'm not defending that. I'm not defending the enjoyment of being in the spotlight and wanting to be the number one nation, that visceral psychological need. Like I'm not defending that. But I am defending the institutions you can build from that impulse. And at least the idea of those institutions. And that seems to be shaky, and maybe it's just like a tragedy of the commons thing, where like just no one wants to be, everyone understands that there needs to be a leader, but no one wants to be the one to take on the cost and responsibilities and pain of doing so. And again, like I said, the only way you take on is if it fulfills a psychological need for your nation. But if all our nationalisms are now about something else, then no one is going to be willing to take on those sacrifices. So that's unfortunate.
I have this kind of unrefined thought now for month, I think, and I've always wanted to write an article about it, but never got to the point where the argument was refined enough for it. But like the title would be "The Price of Hegemony," or "The Price of Being the Hegemonon." Sure. And I guess for me, the basic idea is, if you do not own up to your own role in according to the status you have, not even the one that you aspire to, like you're a third-rate power that tries to be something more than it is, but just by virtue of being, the United States are the world's largest economy. By nature, they have some clout. You cannot escape that. That is impossible. Even if you would downgrade your military again to the levels of 1916 or thereabouts, when Portugal had a stronger army than the United States. Look how much it got you when World War I started. It was possible for a while to stay out of it, but in the end, you were just too powerful not to be drawn in some capacity. And if you do not own up this this role that you have, this influence that you simply cannot escape. And again, I'm not talking about the interventionism, like doubling down on it.
Yeah.
What as you described it, what left and right in the United States have done in the Cold War era with all the interventions and all that kind of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about, but just the clout that you simply have and choose actively to ignore and not to use. This, in my mind, inserts a rot into the system of interdependence between states. So again, Germany is a prime example for this, because we have in the last 10, 15 years invited this rot to take hold twice. Once with the Greek debt crisis and the I don't know how you want to see it, like an appendix of the international financial crisis that, of course, originated in the United States, but is by no means limited to it.
Yep.
And there we really did ignore the role that Germany had in it, as one of the borrowers to Greece and to the American banks. Again, it always takes two for a debt crisis. And we simply ignored this influence that we had, and it did cost us dearly. And then on the other hand, we did invite an even greater rot when we tried to externalize and to outsource our natural leading role within the European Union in terms of the refugee crisis, because the refugee crisis has been going on now for 5 years, and at least, and we were major pushers in a new compromise. The Dublin II Accords. Yep. So if you don't know what they are, they basically stipulate that if you are someone from outside the European Union and you come into the European Union to ask for asylum, you have to apply for asylum in the state you first touched ground on. And if you now project your mental map of Europe, the only way you can touch ground in Germany first is coming by boat through the North Sea. And this is kind of unlikely.
Kind of awkward,
So we basically had this treaty with these Dublin II Accords and outsourced the problem to the states that actually can be entered by refugees first, which is Italy and Greece mostly, because the refugees were coming from North Africa and the Middle East, and to a lesser extent Spain. And we were fine with this. We in Germany, on the progressive side of things, we could stand there and bemoan just how harsh the EU border regime was, sinking refugee boats in the Mediterranean and all that kind of stuff. And, oh my God, look at the Italians, how cruel they are. And, this has nothing to do with us, of course. Sure. And the right ignored the issue altogether. And then in 2015, the pressure became too high in Italy and Greece and Spain. They simply sent those people on, which is kind of sensible. And to be expected at some point. But we didn't own to the position that we had in Europe. Of course, we weren't adjacent countries. This wasn't a crisis that we produced, because we didn't militarily intervene in the Middle East, and we weren't the people who started the civil war in Syria and all that. So our influence in the region was implicit and indirect and all of that. I mean, we're not completely innocent, but in the grand scheme of things, this was not our crisis. But in comparison to Belgium, for example, we are just so big a country and so big an economy that we cannot entirely pull back from it. And by ignoring it and essentially playing Belgium for so long, or the Netherlands or Sweden or whatever you want to take as your apt metaphor, we really did ignore this. And if you are like Great Britain or France, who said, guys, Libya, okay, that was a military operation, and we all know the sorry state of the German army, so it's conceivable that this is one that we take. But here, refugee crisis, guys, this is a question of deep pockets, so please, Germany, open them up. And we didn't. And so we got the refugee crisis of 2015 with 1 million people powering into Germany. And now our deep pockets allow us to integrate them without major pains for the population, which is, of course, a luxury that Greece and Italy, for example, don't have. But if we had asserted our influence before, like 2011 or 2012, and used the clout that we have to really hammer out a fair system of dispersing all those people within the European Union, we could have avoided much problems. And the same is true for debt crisis in Greece. If we had just decided to own up our leading role and, fork over a few billions to Greece, the whole issue would have gone away.
Yeah.
But we didn't. And so now we have a much larger issue on our hands.
You're right. I mean, this, in so many ways, the Syrian civil war has been this kind of stress test for international institutions, whether you're talking military or economic or cultural, dealing with refugees. And in some respects, some international institutions have performed admirably, but overall, there's definitely seems to be a tragic to the commons thing going along with the international order when it comes to the refugee crisis and the Syrian civil war as a whole. And yeah, I would just say as my kind of summarizing point as a whole that the response to that, it means we need, better and more aggressive international institutions. And we need international institutions that can act with, speed and credibility. And we need to go forward with that as the goal, recognizing that, like you say, there really is no ignoring it. And there really is no sitting it out. Because what happens if you do that is either your country still exerts influence, but in these kind of subtle, insidious ways that the people don't really know about and so can't really control, or you just don't influence anything, and then actors like Russia and China step in, as they do. And so on the whole, as frustrating as the failures of the international order can be, I think it behooves us on both sides of the pond and any part of the Western order to make it better rather than give up on it, as Pollyanna-ish and naive as that may sound right now. But sounding like a naive establishment Democrat is kind of my thing, so why would I run away from it now? But that sums up my take on the matter. Anything more from your side of the ocean?
No, not really. I think I droned on long enough about the conundrum in which we find ourselves. Just to continue our long, hallowed tradition of making prognosis about what will happen in elections. I think barring a major catastrophe, Angela Merkel will become our chancellor once again. Sure. So there will be some continuity to German politics at least. So if you are satisfied with German international politics right now, I have some good news for you, because it is unlikely that they will change substantively. But if you want us to either draw in a even more subdued direction, or reorienting ourselves, or to assert more influence, I don't see that coming in the near future.
Solid. And with that, I think we will leave you with that for this current episode of The Atlantic Bridge.
You have been listening to the Atlantic Bridge podcast, politics viewed from both sides of the pond. One episode every fortnight, every Friday. You can follow us on Twitter @StefanSasse and @PurQuentin, on Stefan's German blog www.deliberationdaily.de, or on PurQuentin.tumblr.com. See you soon!